Hey there, welcome to History of Thought 2. And the next two thinkers that we're going to be looking at take us into queer theory. So we're going to revisit Michel Foucault and look at his history of sexuality. And then the next lecture will be talking about Judith Butler. So today, Foucault and history of sexuality, and the next time Judith Butler, but the two are very much interrelated. So, for today's topic, Foucault and History of Sexuality, you actually had two readings. You had an excerpt from Michel Foucault's 1978 book, The History of Sexuality, actually volume 1. He has two other volumes. And you also had just a short reading by Holly Furneaux, a more contemporary reading called Victorian Sexualities, from the British Library website. And it kind of gives you a quick overview of Foucault's idea of the repressive hypothesis and what he's kind of arguing against. So that in a minute. Now, if we were having a live class, we'd do a word association on the board. So I'll probably, before I even do a lecture, but we'll probably do that when we discuss. But, one of the things that Foucault is doing in all of his projects, which we talked about in terms of discipline and punishment, in terms of mental illness, in terms of the idea of medicine. I mean, all of these different topics, he's interested in what the discourse is, and we'll get back to what that means in a minute. But what are all of the ways that we sort of label things? What are the categories we associate with it? What's sort of the body of knowledge that we accumulate about it? So, think about what is sexuality? What are its components? What are its labels? What are its identities? What are the different ways that we define sexuality now, and how has the idea been sort of conceived and defined in the past? Are there opposing views and conceptions of the quote truth of sexuality? So we could say that for a long time, one of the ways we conceived of sexuality was normal versus quote abnormal sexuality and sexual desires. But if you go back any farther, is sexuality an identity, or is it about acts in terms of how society conceptualizes it? And so this is really what Foucault wants us to think about. How do we understand, label, and categorize sexuality now as opposed to previous eras? Did we even have a thing called sexuality that we conceived of? Is one system more truthful or real than the others? Now, Foucault would say, I don't care about that question. But, we can think of the implications of that. And what are the power relations wrapped up in our knowledge about sexuality, certain sort of regimes of truth, quote, truth about sexuality? How can different systems of discourse about sexuality be repressive and liberating, or both? And Foucault would say, both, right? That every system kind of has both. So what Foucault is doing, in the history of sexuality that the chapter that you've read an excerpt from, is that he starts out by sort of rejecting our contemporary view of Victorian sexuality. So this would have been sort of like the 19th century view of sexuality, that there's this idea of the repressive hypothesis. That he's rejecting this previous convention about the story about sexual repression versus freedom. So here's the story that the repressive hypothesis represents, which Foucault says is kind of a myth, that sexuality used to be more free in the West. So sort of prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the Industrial Revolution. Yet then those damn Victorians repressed us all. And it wasn't until sort of pushed sexuality into literally the closet and sort of limited sort of what was possible into kind of this, what we would call sort of heterosexual, heteronormative, marriage-based relationship. And it wasn't until the liberation of the 1960s that we are eventually starting to be sexually free again. So what Foucault is saying is, actually, if you look at Victorian sort of discourse, the language that's going on, Victorians are actually obsessed with sex and sexuality, researching it, labeling various, quote, deviations and, quote, perversions, right? I have these in quotation marks, trying to, quote, fix it, trying to define what is normal and sort of clinically figure out what is abnormal and control the, quote, abnormal. And what Foucault calls kind of the other Victorians, right? Fallen women, prostitutes, nymphomaniacs, masturbating children, hysterical women, homosexuals, right? That label emerges at that time. All become big topics of discussion, categorization, and scientific investigation in Victorian times, right? So kind of the start really kind of in the mid to late 1800s and into the early 1900s. And contra the repressive hypothesis that says, hey, the Victorians were super repressed, and then all of a sudden you get this shift in the 60s. And we're in a totally different system now gradually, right, where we're liberating our sexuality. Foucault's like, actually, Victorian times are kind of when we get our modern understanding of sexuality from. So he wants to kind of take us out of this repressed, liberated model and think about how our understandings of sexuality are actually very much rooted in this kind of enlightenment, apply science to the human world, to understand it and control it, as well as sort of very kind of enlightenment notions of the self, that we are Victorians in a lot of way. And the important part isn't sort of repression liberating, but it's really about the self and identity. And that's similar. The Victorians did something different in terms of sexuality, in terms of the idea of identity and the self, and we're still in that system. So I'll explain that. So really what happens in kind of Victorian times in the 1900s is the very concept of sexuality emerges, as opposed to sexual practices. And this idea of sexuality becomes central to our identity. And that's still something that persists today. So the emergence of the idea of sexuality and the notion that every individual has a sexuality is a relatively recent development in Western societies. This is really what emerges kind of in the 1800s. And, not that people did all sorts of things with all sorts of people and other things, right? I mean, people had sort of sexual practices for all of human history. And there are obviously various prohibitions and various kind of normative judgments placed on those acts, those activities, right? And those prohibitions definitely could be repressive, but the very idea of sexuality, that this is an innate part of our identity and our self, and we can label it and define it, and it is a central core part of who we are. Be it a sexuality in that time which is seen as quote normal or quote abnormal, or even if you're in a system where you're breaking down those kinds of judgments, the very idea that something called sexuality is central to who we are as human beings and an innate part of ourselves, that comes from Victorian times, and that is still with us. So instead of a different kind of discourse, Foucault wants to say, instead of like they were repressed, now we're liberated, Foucault wants to say we're in the same discourse, we're in the same regime of truth as the Victorians. Maybe sort of our attitude towards sexuality has become more what we would see as liberated. Maybe the idea of quote abnormal has been questioned, rightly so, but the idea of this idea of sexuality being about our identity and not just like acts we engage in is a new way of looking at it that emerges in Victorian times. So acts become identities with modernity. I mean, again, certainly prohibitions related to sexual acts and consequences for breaking prohibitions prior to Victorian times, prior to the modern era. But this is not seen kind of as an essential part of oneself, and it is considered an essential part of identity in, for like the past 200 years. So what is, hold on, oops. So sorry about that, my alarm went off. So, as this quote from Foucault says, sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries to gradually uncover. It is a name that can be given to a historical construct, not a furtive reality that is difficult to grasp, but a great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. So, hold on. Sorry, you guys. I'll get to that in a second. So what is kind of Foucault's main aim in the history of sexuality? I mean, he says he wants to examine how sex is put into discourse, but what does that mean? So really one of the sort of things that he's looking at historically is the medicalization of sex and sexuality with modernity. And this really goes hand in hand with this idea of sexuality being central to our identity. So, in Victorian times, in the early 20th century, you get the creation of categories of what's, quote, normal and what's, quote, abnormal or even, quote, deviant sexualities. Obviously, I'm not endorsing these terms. I'm just talking about sort of the discourse. And I think a really great example of this is Foucault's discussion as the emergence of homosexuality as a category. So Foucault argues that was once a legal and or religious prohibitions against certain acts. So against sodomy. So, you go back into, medieval Christianity. There aren't prohibitions about having the identity of being gay or queer, or what we today call queer, or of having certain desires. The prohibitions are about acts that people engage in. So by the mid-1800s, Foucault says that these prohibitions against certain acts had transformed into something different, the category of the homosexual. He states, quote, "The 19th century homosexual becomes a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, and a morphology, with an indiscrete anatomy and possibly a mysterious physiology. Nothing that went into his total composition was unaffected by his sexuality." So we can think about how this is something that becomes very much medicalized and scientized and studied and dissected, but we're sort of like creating this category of different kinds of sexuality, and this is deviant sexuality, and then also how it's centrally tied to people's identity, right? That it's about sort of the total composition of who you are as a person is innately tied to this central idea of sexuality, not acts, not desires, but inherently who you are as a person. And think about how these categories come about. How does the idea of the homosexual come about? How do they circulate? How do they gain dominance, right? So think about that capillary-like model of power where it isn't, there isn't some sovereign saying, we now define people who engage in these acts as this, right? It's about doctors, teachers, psychiatrists, and parents, constructing these categories and starting to circulate and sort of working ground up. I mean, it's about sort of the power of scientists, but, it's about kind of new forms of knowledge and how they interact with power. And then think about how these categories get internalized, how they become kind of part of our identity. This is the panopticon-like process, right? This is the gaze of the guard that we turn inward and we internalize, and how patients and students and kids internalize these identities, right? And it's also, again, like all of Foucault's other arguments, about local sites of power and the production of knowledge about sexuality. So again, it's not some proclamation from some overarching sovereign that causes change. It's the gradual process and change of how we talk and think about something like sexuality, this capillary-like system of power, the disciplinary power then that we internalize the gaze and we self-monitor. So this means categories and language can be sites of what we may see as repression, but also more freedom. So not in the reading that you were assigned, but elsewhere, Foucault has talked about how this internalized identity, that people turn the gaze inward and start identifying people who engage in certain acts with certain men who engage in sexual acts with other men, internalize this identity of homosexual. And it actually then emerges by the mid-20th century as an identity that a lot of people are very attached to. And it actually then it gives this identity, and this common identity also is a site for repression, absolutely, But also, this common identity gives individuals a space to create communities, to organize politically, to demand equality. So there's a power in sort of that idea of this internal this identity of this is core to who I am as a person. Then you can't discriminate against me based on it because I was born this way, right? And there's a political power to that. So, Foucault, again, he's not saying, all of a sudden we're repressed and now we're liberated. That there are what we would call maybe repressive and liberating aspects of any kind of system, any kind of discursive system. So, sexuality as an identity maybe, has some negative aspects, right? Especially in terms of labeling people sort of normal and abnormal, absolutely. But it also gives people an opportunity, even though an identity is sort of being internalized, and created through sort of that panopticon-like system, that disciplinary power where you turn the gaze inward. It's still then creating space for what we would call positive political change. And sorry, I talked over all of that, and here's the slide for everything I just said, but I think everything I said is there. So really, instead of seeing power as, let's say, repressive or liberatory, or his model of sort of power, this capillary-like power, Foucault wouldn't really use the words repressive or liberating. That's kind of that idea is what he's trying to push against. He would say constraining or enabling. So sort of internalizing a label like, quote, homosexual is both sort of constraining to one's possibilities and one's freedom, but it can also sort of be enabling, and it can be sort of affirming, and it can actually sort of lead to more freedom, especially if you're sort of creating communities around that identity. And this is kind of the sort of double-edged sword of identity politics, all kinds of identity politics. Ultimately, Foucault is arguing that there's no essentialism here. And that's kind of a controversial topic. We'll talk about that later. But, you can think about this in terms of something like race as well, right? I mean, we talk a lot about the Black experience in America, for example. I mean, at the end of the day, that's a false construct. Right? We know that race is a social and cultural construct, and we know that there's as many different ways to experience Blackness in America as there are people who identify as African American. But even given all of that, there's certainly sort of something positive and important in terms of community, in terms of solidarity, in terms of organizing, in terms of demanding rights, in terms of sort of enabling more freedom for people who have been targeted and repressed. So, the idea of something being innate to our identity, it can kind of cut both ways. So, how do you think, and this is something we'll talk more about in class. Hold on, let me move this over there. How do you think his view of power, especially when it comes to sexuality, applies to our current regime of truth about sexuality? What are the consequences of saying that something is socially constructed, that it's not an innate part? Because what Foucault is saying is this idea that we are innately have some kind of sexuality and that we are born that way, and that is a core inherent part of our identity, and that it can be revealed, the truth can be revealed. I think that's kind of what coming out is, right? Revealing the truth, both to yourself, sort of discovering your true sexuality that can be uncovered, and then also sort of then confessing it, that's also this liberating experience. Foucault would say that discourse about sexuality is what's new from Victorian times. But what are the consequences of saying this is socially constructed? I mean, if something is considered biologically innate and given, do we somehow give it more legitimacy? Do modern discourses privilege natural, biological, and innate? And why? I mean, think about things like born this way or live your truth. Right? Those are politically very important kinds of statements to make. So what are kind of the limitations of that view? But what are also the dangers of pushing against it and deconstructing it? There's this idea of strategic essentialism that is very important in a lot of activist circles, that even if sort of philosophically we recognize the socially constructed nature of things like race or sexuality or gender, that it can be politically really important to privilege or to sort of stick to sort of natural or biological or innate ideas about these concepts, because you're more likely to sort of gain more freedom, more rights, right? Others, sort of more normative kinds of bodies are more likely to kind of accept giving you rights. So I think it's kind of interesting in class. What I would like to think about is kind of all of the, I think, increasingly emerging notions of fluidity when it comes to sexuality, right? And how that is maybe in line with what Foucault is talking about in terms of discourse, or it is also kind of pushing against this Victorian regime of truth of sexuality being such an innate part of my identity. It's interesting. When an interviewer inquired one time whether Foucault thought homosexuality, remember Foucault himself identified as a gay man, was a, quote, innate predisposition or the result of social conditioning, Foucault himself replied, "On this question, I have absolutely nothing to say. No comment." And pressed even more for details, he explained he would not use his position of authority to, quote, traffic in opinions. So in other words, Foucault isn't even interested at all in this question of whether sexuality is biologically determined or socially constructed or some combination of both. What he wanted to understand was how sexuality came to be the question, the thing that we have to somehow understand about ourselves that somehow reveals our true selves and who we are. And why we're invested in this sort of view of sexuality that is a pretty relatively new view of sexuality. And this is really wrapped up in Foucault's larger views of the self, which we haven't talked about too much in this class, but I want to talk about a little briefly here. So Foucault and the self, a little bit we can go back to the existentialist idea, right? That existence precedes essence. This is where a lot of 20th century Western philosophy is headed towards, this idea of sort of deconstructing all of these kinds of essentialist notions of biology, of gender, of race, of sexuality, all these kinds of things, that there is no essence to who we are as human beings that precedes sort of our existence, our life. It's sort of the understanding that human reality is sort of socially constructed and socialized. So for Foucault, individuals, in the terms of, an essential aspect of individuals, don't exist prior to power and are enacted upon by sovereign and disciplinary power, but especially these kinds of mechanisms of disciplinary power and self-regulation and internalizing the gaze. That for Foucault, individuals are constituted by this system of power knowledge. But there is no such thing as the individual subject that stands outside of history. So in a different work, Foucault says, quote, "One has to dispense with the constituent subject to get rid of the subject itself. That's to say, to arrive at an analysis which can account for the constitution of the subject within a historical framework." And this is what I would call genealogy, which he gets from Nietzsche. That's different history. He goes on, "That is a form of history which can account for the constitution of knowledges, discourses, domains of objects, etc., without having to make reference to a subject, which is either transcendental in relation to the field of events or runs in its empty sameness through the course of history." So Foucault's exploration of prisons, of asylums, of clinics, of sexuality, all of it together can be seen as the history of the creation of the modern self. The creation, which is fluid, which is not fixed, which is constantly in motion, and is not an exploration of the history of a fixed given subject, a fixed given sort of identity, and that these discourses of truth. So, what is the truth of sexuality that has been hidden and that now can be revealed? Right? Foucault would argue that is a false way of looking at it, but that's how we look at it. Right, these discourses of trying to sort of reveal the truth, which in a lot of ways is part of science and Enlightenment thinking, help construct certain kinds of identities and certain ways of looking at the self, which is especially true with the emergence of disciplinary power. So Foucault would say there really isn't even such a thing as the self until that gaze is turned inward and we become sort of these docile bodies that self-regulate. So we will talk about all of that and more in our next class when we talk about Foucault and also Judith Butler. So see you in class.